Dirk Bogarde was part of the new breed of actors who emerged in the late 1940s and 1950s like Montgomery Clift and Alain Delon. He had a brooding intensity and an attraction to more serious and intelligent roles. However, unlike Clift and Delon, Hollywood chewed Bogarde up and spat him out. The British star then set out on an unconventional career in European cinema, becoming one of the most admired and acclaimed actors of the 20th century. He used his roles to enormous political and social effect. All the while, he was secretly living a life that he could never publicly admit to, and he knew Hollywood would tear his mystery open. Before we dive into the heartbreaking final act of this legend's life, shout out your city in the comments, grab a drink, find a quiet spot, and stay with me as we peel back the layers of this old Hollywood mystery to understand the enigmatic legend of Dirk Bogarde. One must first travel back to the fragile peace of post-war London in 1921. He was born Derek Jules Gaspard Ulrich Niven van den Bogarde in the leafy, artistic suburb of Hampstead on March 28th. The world he entered was one of profound transitions, a time when the British Empire was still nursing the wounds of the Great War, while the seeds of modern classic cinema were beginning to take root. This was an era where class, decorum, and the preservation of public image were the ultimate currencies. Young Derek was born into a household defined by culture and high expectations. His father, Ulrich van den Bogarde, was a man of immense influence as the very first art editor of the Times, a figure who essentially shaped the visual aesthetic of British journalism. His mother, Margaret Niven, was a former actress who had tasted the spotlight in the play Bunty Pulls the Strings, but had ultimately sacrificed her own creative ambitions to meet the domestic demands of her husband. This dynamic created a unique pressure cooker of artistic yearning and rigid social conformity, a precursor to the many conflicts that would later define the life of Dirk Bogarde as one of the most complex old Hollywood stars. The boy who would become a matinee idol grew up in a world of refined sensibilities, surrounded by his sister Elizabeth and younger brother Gareth. Derek was educated at prestigious institutions such as Allen Glen School in Glasgow and University College School in London. His early years were not spent dreaming of the silver screen, but rather of the canvas at Chelsea Polytechnic. He studied commercial art under the tutelage of giants like Henry Moore. His family expected him to follow in his father's footsteps, perhaps becoming an art critic or a painter. However, the pull of the theater was an inheritance he could not ignore. Against his father's wishes and fueled by his mother's quieted dreams, Derek left his art studies to train as an actor. The early days were far from glamorous. Before he became a centerpiece of British cinema history, he toiled as a commercial artist and a scene designer, picking up minor roles with the Amersham Repertory Company. His West End debut in J.B. Priestley Cornelius seemed to signal a rising career. But the gears of history were about to grind his personal ambitions to a halt. In September 1939, as the shadows of fascism lengthened across Europe, the world plunged into darkness. This historical rupture would provide the catalyst for the greatest untold story of his life, leaving a World War II trauma that would haunt every frame of his future films. In early 1940, the aspiring actor traded his costumes for the uniform of the Queen's Royal Regiment for 5 long years. Derek served with a distinction that earned him 7 medals. But the cost to his psyche was immeasurable. As an intelligence officer under Field Marshal Montgomery, he was tasked with photo reconnaissance and air photographic interpretation. It was his job to identify targets for RAF Bomber Command, effectively deciding which villages in France, Holland, and Germany would be reduced to rubble to halt the German advance. He moved through Normandy following D-Day, witnessing the visceral reality of a continent in flames. It was during this period that the future Dirk Bogarde encountered horrors that no amount of Hollywood fame could ever sponge away. He once recounted a chilling moment in the ruins of a French village where he thought he saw a row of footballs in the rubble, only to realize with sickening horror that they were the heads of children from a local convent school who had been lined up for safety only to be crushed by the falling masonry. This was not a movie set. This was a raw, unfiltered Hollywood tragedy occurring in real time, a primal wound that stayed registered in his soul forever. The climax of his wartime ordeal occurred on April 20th, 1945, when he was among the first Allied officers to enter the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. The sight of what he called Dante's Inferno changed him forever. He described seeing mountains of the dead and survivors whose bodies were little more than empty husks. He recalled a girl in prison pajamas, her hair gone and her spirit broken, who spoke English to him because she recognized his badge. The profound disgust and anger he felt toward the perpetrators of these atrocities left him with a lasting antipathy toward Germany. A paradox, considering that he would later give some of his most brilliant performances playing German characters. Another traumatic event in Normandy cemented his internal tattooing of shock. After a jeep ahead of him hit a mine, he found a soldier gurgling in the grass, pleading to be killed to end the agony, with shaking hands. Derek reached for his revolver, but before he could act, another soldier provided the mercy kill. The sound of that gurgling voice begging for death would later be echoed in his haunting performance in the 1964 film King and Country for Dirk Bogarde. The war was not just a service, it was a total deconstruction of his humanity, when he was finally demobilized. Derek returned to an England that was weary and gray. He was no longer the naive boy who had wanted to paint. He was a man who had seen the absolute bottom of human depravity. His agent advised him to adopt a more striking name, and thus Derek Jules Gaspard became Dirk Bogarde. He returned to the stage, but the transition from the horrors of the front line to the artifice of the theater was jarring. In 1947, his performance in Power Without Glory caught the attention of the legendary Noel Coward, who urged him to persevere. A talent scout from the rank organization soon saw the raw intensity in his eyes, an intensity born from real blood and real mud, and signed him to a contract. He began with a one-line role as a policeman in Dancing with Crime, a humble beginning for a man who would soon be known as the idol of the Odeons. But even as the lights of fame began to flicker on, Bogarde carried his secrets with him. He was a man living in a society where his true self was a crime and his wartime memories were a burden. He entered the studio system not as a conqueror, but as a survivor of a golden age scandal that had yet to be written. The mask of the movie star was beginning to take shape, but underneath, the internal tattooing of his past remained, hidden from a public that only wanted to see a handsome face. This was the beginning of a long, calculated escape into the world of classic cinema, a journey that would eventually lead to the revolutionary Victim 1961 film and the haunting beauty of the Death in Venice movie. Dirk Bogarde was ready to play the game of Hollywood, but he would do it on his own terms, protecting the mystery of his life with a brooding intensity that would captivate the world for decades to come. The transition from the blood-soaked fields of Normandy to the shimmering lights of London's film studios was a jarring paradox for the man now known as Dirk Bogarde. How does a soldier who witnessed the absolute nadir of human morality pivot to the manufactured charm required by the rank organization for Bogarde? Acting was not just a profession. It was a protective layer, a mask to hide the internal tattooing of his wartime trauma. After several years of toiling in minor roles, his moment of destiny arrived in 1950 with the crime thriller The Blue Lamp. In a stroke of casting genius, Bogarde was given the role of Tom Riley, a young hoodlum and cop killer. At the time, killing a police officer was considered an unspeakable crime in England, and the notoriety of the role established him as an actor of note. He wasn't just a pretty face. He was the first of the intense neurotics and charismatic villains that would fascinate the British public for a decade. This was the beginning of his journey into the heart of British cinema history. But even as fame beckoned, the weight of his secret life began to press against the edges of his public persona. As the 1950s progressed, Bogarde found himself under the wing of the prolific producer Betty Box, who was instrumental in crafting his image as a matinee idol. The studio system of the Golden Age understood that a star was a product, and Bogarde was packaged to be the ultimate British heartthrob. His breakthrough role as Dr. Simon Sparrow in the 1954 comedy Doctor in the House catapulted him to a level of stardom that was almost overwhelming. The film drew a staggering 17 million viewers in its first year, making Bogarde the leading British movie star of the era. Soon, he was dubbed the Idol of the Odeons, a title that reflected his immense box office draw, but also the suffocating nature of his celebrity. On the surface, he was the bachelor that every girl in England wanted to marry. He even famously went on a date with a shorthand typist who won a teen queen contest. But behind the flashing bulbs and the screaming fans, Bogarde was deeply uncomfortable. He suffered from debilitating stage fright and found the aggressive crowds at stage doors increasingly difficult to handle. The world saw a confident, charming doctor, but the man underneath was still the haunted intelligence officer, desperate for a sliver of genuine privacy. This period marked the emergence of the great divide in his life, the difference between the man on the poster and the man in the shadows. By the mid-1950s, Dirk Bogarde had already entered the most important and enduring relationship of his life with his manager, Anthony Forwood. Forwood, a former theatrical manager who had been married to actress Glynis Johns, became Bogarde's life partner, though their bond remained hidden from a public that was not yet ready for such an untold story. To maintain his matinee idol status, Bogarde had to play the game of Hollywood and the rank organization, where his sexuality was a potential golden age scandal that could destroy his career in an instant. This forced him into a state of perpetual performance, both on and off the screen. Was his tragedy a result of the industry's ruthlessness, or was it the crushing weight of social expectation? In 1958, Bogarde attempted to break the mold of the charming British lead by venturing to America for the film Song Without End. Portraying the composer Franz Liszt, his experience in Tinseltown was nothing short of a Hollywood tragedy. The production was plagued by delays, censorship issues, and the tragic death of its director, Charles Vidor, who suffered a heart attack during filming. Bogarde later admitted to feeling a sense of relief at Vidor's passing, hoping the film would be cancelled. The atmosphere was salvaged only when the legendary George Cukor was brought in to finish the movie. Cukor, known for his sensitivity, immediately lifted spirits, though he refused to take a directing credit, in a move that signaled Bogarde's resistance to studio artifice. He rejected the traditional long hair of the era for Liszt, opting instead for a look reminiscent of Elvis Presley. Despite winning a Golden Globe nomination for his performance, the film was a commercial disaster that dimmed his prospects as a leading man in Hollywood and plunged him into a period of depression. During the filming of Song Without End, Bogarde developed a profound attraction to his co-star, the French actress Capucine. He even went as far as to tell her he wanted to marry her, a rare romantic overture to a woman in his life. Capucine, who was bisexual and struggled with bipolar disorder, shared a deep kinship with Bogarde, though their relationship ultimately remained one of lasting friendship rather than marriage. This failed Hollywood stint was a turning point. It proved that the glitz of classic cinema could not offer him the artistic fulfillment he craved. He felt the transition from the reality of war to the sudden, superficial stardom happened all too soon, returning to England. He began to reject the paper-thin parts in paperweight films that rank continued to offer. He was a man seeking a revolution, a way to use his fame for something more significant than being a heartthrob. The conflict between his public image and his private reality reached a breaking point in the early 1960s. He was a major star, but he was restless. He began to choose roles that were increasingly provocative and dangerous. He starred in The Singer, Not the Song, a film that gained a cult following for its campy undertones and Bogarde's outrageous black leather trousers, a subtle nod to the sexuality he couldn't yet openly discuss. He worked with the blacklisted director Joseph Losey on The Sleeping Tiger, beginning a collaboration that would eventually define the more intellectual and serious phase of his career. Bogarde was no longer content with the mask of the star. He wanted to tear it off, even if it meant exposing himself to the very scandals he had spent years avoiding. The edgy, revolutionary and dangerous Dirk Bogarde was about to emerge. setting the stage for his most controversial and courageous act, the 1961 film Victim. He was about to prove that he was not just a survivor of the war, but a survivor of a system that demanded he be anyone but himself. By the arrival of the 1960s, Dirk Bogarde found himself trapped within the gears of a relentless industry machine that demanded he remain a hollow icon of British charm. The Rank Organization, which had held him under contract for 14 years, viewed him less as a serious artist and more as a lucrative asset to be exploited. This was the era of the idol of the Odeons, a period where Bogarde's face on a poster guaranteed sold-out theaters but offered him little in the way of creative substance. He was a man craving something more fulfilling, desperate to test himself in difficult and complex roles that reflected the darker shades of the human condition he had witnessed during the war. Yet, the studio moguls were hesitant to risk their golden goose on anything that deviated from the safe, romantic formula that had made him a national heartthrob. This fundamental tension between artistic integrity and commercial survival became the primary battlefield of his career. The Hollywood tragedy of Dirk Bogarde was not a lack of talent, but a refusal to be devoured by a system that chewed actors up and spat them out. Unlike his contemporaries Alain Delon or Montgomery Clift, who navigated the studio system with a different kind of intensity, Bogarde realized that the Tinseltown machine would eventually tear his carefully guarded mystery open. He was living a life that he could never publicly admit to, a reality that stood in stark contrast to the bachelor persona the press so eagerly promoted. This untold story centered on his relationship with Anthony Forwood, his manager and life partner, whom he had met as far back as 1939. Forwood was more than a professional handler. He was the anchor in Bogarde's chaotic world. Yet their bond had to remain invisible. In an age of intrusive tabloids and the cruel gossip of figures like Hedda Hopper, the threat of a Golden Age scandal was a constant shadow. Bogarde knew that to stay in the mainstream spotlight was to risk everything he held dear. The friction with the establishment reached a fever pitch on the set of films like The Singer, Not the Song. Bogarde's enthusiasm for the project was abysmally low, particularly when the studio insisted on casting John Mills as the priest opposite his Mexican bandit character. Bogarde was so opposed to the casting that he threatened to make life unbearable for everyone involved. The resulting film, though now a cult classic for its campy homosexual undertones and Bogarde's provocative black leather trousers, was a critical and commercial failure that underscored his growing alienation from the mainstream. He was a man at war with his own image, realizing that if he did not break the mold himself, the mold would eventually suffocate him. This internal and professional conflict led to the most pivotal and dangerous decision of his career, accepting the lead role in the Victim 1961 film. At the time, this was a shocking shift for a star of his magnitude. Victim was a groundbreaking project, the first British film to address the persecution of homosexuals with genuine sympathy. It was a black-and-white thriller revolving around gay men being blackmailed with the threat of exposure and imprisonment. A bold subject released 6 years before the Sexual Offences Act would eventually decriminalize such acts in England. The role of the lawyer Melville Farr had been turned down by several other leading men, including James Mason and Stuart Granger, who feared the devastating impact it could have on their careers. Bogarde, however, accepted the challenge eagerly, despite knowing it would put a blinding spotlight on his own bachelorhood and raise questions he could not answer truthfully without risking his own freedom. The production of Victim was a calculated risk that pitted Bogarde against the prevailing morality of the time. The film was notable for being the first in British cinema history to actually use the word homosexual on screen. Prior to this, LGBTQ history in film had been communicated almost exclusively through slurs or disparaging stereotypes. Bogarde's performance was hailed as an act of immense bravery. Lord Arran, who later introduced the bill to legalize homosexuality, publicly thanked Bogarde, noting that his role had helped 1 million men live without fear. However, the cost was significant. The film was denied a seal of approval in the United States, limiting its release in mainstream American theaters. More personally, the film shattered the illusion of the matinee idol for many of his previous fans. Bogarde was no longer interested in being a commercial movie star. He was evolving into an artist, a transition that cost him his mass popularity, but earned him a place in the pantheon of serious actors, following the earthquake that was Victim. Bogarde began a long and fruitful collaboration with the expatriate director Joseph Losey, a man who had himself been blacklisted by Hollywood for his political beliefs. Together, they created a series of Joseph Losey films that explored the darker, more ambiguous facets of human nature. In The Servant, 1963, Bogarde gave a masterclass in subtlety as Hugo Barrett, a manservant who stealthily turns the tables on his wealthy master to become the dominant figure in a twisted power struggle. This performance won him his first BAFTA for Best Actor and signaled his true mastery of the craft. They collaborated again on King and Country, 1964, a grim World War I drama where Bogarde played a captain forced to execute a deserter, a role that mirrored the traumatic gurgling voice he had heard in The Long Grass of Normandy years before. Despite the critical acclaim of these works, Bogarde continued to face the private demons of his own past and the pressures of a career that rarely succeeded commercially in the eyes of the studio businessman. He famously lamented that it was pointless to be superb in a commercial failure. Yet he continued to choose roles that the distributors shied away from. His work in films like Accident 1967, and later his portrayal of the dying Gustav von Aschenbach in the Death in Venice movie 1971, showed a man who had moved far beyond the reach of Hollywood's superficiality. In Death in Venice, Bogarde fully embraced a grotesque transformation, appearing on screen with white face powder and running hair dye to depict a man lost in a silent obsession. It was a performance that concluded the idle chapter of his life forever. The climax of this era of conflict was arguably his role in The Night Porter, 1974, a film so charged with intensity and controversy that it remains a subject of debate today. Portraying a former Nazi officer who reignites a sadomasochistic relationship with a camp survivor, Bogarde delved into the very depths of human depravity he had witnessed at Bergen-Belsen. Some critics denounced the film as offensive, but Bogarde's commitment to exploring the lesser-seen sides of human nature was unwavering. By this point, he and Anthony Forwood had already retreated to a restored farmhouse in France, leaving the grinding machine of the industry behind. Bogarde had survived the studio system, he had survived the war, and he had survived the crushing weight of his own secrets by channeling them into some of the most profound performances in the history of classic cinema. He had paid the price for his integrity, trading the easy adoration of the masses for the enduring respect of those who value the truth, however dark it may be. As the 1970s bled into the 80s, the man who was once the ultimate matinee idol began to fade from the silver screen by his own design. Dirk Bogarde acted in only 7 films over his final 2 decades, often lamenting the pointless nature of excelling in commercial failures. Seeking solace from the industry's ruthlessness, he and Anthony Forwood had retreated to a 15th-century farmhouse in Provence, France, where Bogarde turned his creative fire toward writing. However, the tranquility of their French sanctuary was shattered in 1988 when Forwood passed away. Bogarde was left heartbroken and physically shattered, having suffered a major stroke during heart surgery around the same time. The silence in their home near Grasse became an echo of a Hollywood tragedy that no script could fix. He eventually returned to London, living a reclusive life in a Chelsea flat, his health declining further after another paralyzing stroke in 1996. By May 1998, the man who had survived World War II trauma and the crushing weight of a secret life required constant nursing care. Dirk Bogarde, ever the master of his own narrative, created a living will with a no-resuscitation order, becoming a vocal supporter of voluntary euthanasia. He did not wish for a long, drawn-out exit from the stage of life. On May 7, 1999, he spent his final day in the company of his longtime friend, Lauren Bacall, a fellow survivor of the Golden Age. The following day, May 8, 1999. Dirk Bogarde died of a sudden heart attack in his Chelsea home. It was a quiet end to a revolutionary life. Occurring exactly 54 years after the war, he had helped end. There were no cameras, no flashing bulbs, and no screaming fans. Just the final curtain call for a man who had spent a lifetime protecting his mystery. In death, Bogarde remained as enigmatic as he was in life, respecting his explicit wishes to be just forgotten. His family held a private funeral with no memorial service. The public, which had once mobbed him at stage doors, was left to mourn a legend who had already slipped into the shadows. His ashes were taken back to the land where he had found the most peace, scattered at his former estate, Le Pigeonnier, in the hills of southern France. While his private life remained an untold story for many years, the post-mortem tributes were glowing. Critics hailed him as perhaps the finest and most complete actor of classic cinema. The Golden Age scandal he had so carefully avoided was replaced by a legacy of immense courage and artistic integrity. Dirk Bogarde had finally achieved the ultimate privacy he craved, leaving behind a body of work that continues to challenge and inspire. Looking back at the radiant doctor, Simon Sparrow, it is hard to reconcile that polished matinee idol with the grotesque, deteriorating Gustav von Aschenbach in the Death in Venice movie. This stark contrast represents the profound price Dirk Bogarde paid for his stardom. To maintain his public persona as a heartthrob, he had to endure secretly living a life that he could never publicly admit to. Knowing that Hollywood would tear his mystery open if given the chance, he traded his true identity and personal happiness for the flickering adoration of the masses. We are drawn to his tragedy because it reveals the internal tattooing of a man who spent his life performing, even when the cameras were off. His journey from a commercial star to an art house legend was a desperate attempt to reclaim a soul that the studio system had tried to homogenize into a marketable product. The tragedy of Dirk Bogarde was not a personal failure, but a damning indictment of a ruthless system. Hollywood and the British studio system of the Golden Age acted as a crushing machine, treating human beings as mere assets to be exploited. The persecution of homosexuals during that era forced one of cinema's greatest talents into a state of permanent deception to survive. Even when Bogarde took the courageous step with the Victim 1961 film to challenge these prejudices, the industry fought back, with American censors refusing to classify the film due to its positive depiction of homosexuality. This systemic cruelty echoes into the present day. While technology has evolved, the way we consume and discard our icons often remains just as hollow. We still demand that our stars fit into narrow, digestible boxes, often ignoring the human cost behind the public facade. Ultimately, we must not remember Dirk Bogarde as a victim of his circumstances, but as a revolutionary who mastered his craft under the most trying conditions. He was, as described in his own time, the finest, most complete actor on the screen, a man whose commitment to the truth of a role often outweighed his own safety. Whether he was identifying targets as an intelligence officer in the war or performing a mercy kill on his career to save his integrity, he lived with a brooding intensity that remains unmatched. His legacy is the million men who no longer live in fear because of his bravery in taking on challenging roles. Dirk Bogarde proved that fame is fleeting, but an authentic legacy is carved from the courage to be oneself. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadow of a legend, please like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from the Golden Age.